I never thought the day I would marry the love of my life would start with a text from my parents saying, "Don't come to the wedding." I stared at my phone in disbelief, my hand trembling as I read the words over and over. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, not because of pre-wedding nerves, but because the people I had counted on my whole life were actively trying to exclude me from the most important day of my life. My name is Claire Donovan, I'm 29, and I own one of the most beautiful event venues in Charleston, South Carolina. The irony that my parents were demanding I stay away from a celebration that I literally had spent years building the perfect space for wasn't lost on me. It felt surreal, like something out of a twisted movie script, but unfortunately, this was my reality. And if I learned anything in the last decade, it's that you have to rise above betrayal to take control of your own happiness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in a traditional household, my parents, Margaret and Howard Donovan, had always made it clear that appearances were everything. They were part of Charleston's social elite, attending gala events, country club fundraisers, and charity dinners, while my life as a business owner in event planning seemed to matter less and less in their eyes. I had taken over Magnolia Hall, a historic property my grandmother had left me, and transformed it into a premier wedding venue that attracted couples from all over the state. But despite my professional success, my personal life remained a sore subject with them. My engagement to Ethan, a kind-hearted school teacher, was apparently not prestigious enough for the Donovan standard, though he had won my heart completely. The morning I received the text from my mother, I was in the middle of overseeing final decorations for the ceremony space. The room was flooded with natural light, delicate strings of fairy lights were draped across the exposed wooden beams, and bouquets of pale pink peonies and white hydrangeas rested on every table. My wedding planner, Jennifer, had everything coordinated down to the napkin folds and candle placement. And yet, as I held the phone in my hand, a cold sense of betrayal swept through me. I couldn't reconcile the woman who had taught me to ride a bike, who had kissed my scraped knees, with the person sending me this cruel ultimatum. I remember pacing the polished hardwood floors of Magnolia Hall, trying to think logically. "Claire, breathe," Jennifer said gently, noticing the tension in my shoulders. I looked at her and forced a smile, but my mind was racing. Could I reach them? Should I even try? I imagined calling my father, Howard, whose voice could swing from charm to icy judgment in seconds. "Claire, you know what we expect, just reconsider." But I knew there was nothing I could say to change their minds. They were entrenched in their opinions, and somehow Ethan and I were the problem. The realization stung harder than any pre-wedding jitters ever could. I glanced around the room and couldn't help but notice the symbolism of it all. Here I was, surrounded by everything I had worked for, a space that was my creation, and yet my family wanted to erase me from the very moment it was meant to shine. The irony burned, and something inside me clicked. This wasn't just about their rejection. It was about reclaiming control of my own story. Magnolia Hall had always represented possibility and new beginnings, and now it was going to be the stage for my triumph, whether my parents liked it or not. As I began making calls to the last-minute vendors, I realized how many people had placed their trust in me. The florist, the caterer, the lighting team, they were all counting on me to deliver a perfect day. I couldn't let my parents' petty vendetta overshadow the celebration of love and commitment that Ethan and I had worked so hard to create. My phone buzzed again, and I saw a message from my younger sister, Lily. I had hoped she might be an ally, a bridge between my parents and me, but her text was short and neutral. "I don't know what to say, Claire. I'll see you there, I guess." The uncertainty was painful. Even within my own family, the line between support and judgment was razor thin. By noon, I had made a decision. I would not let Margaret and Howard's attempt to control me dictate my happiness. I gathered my bridal party in the main hall and shared the news, trying to inject some levity into the situation. Looks like it's just us and anyone else who actually cares about love over titles. And to my relief, they laughed. Their energy was infectious, reminding me that family wasn't only defined by blood, but by the people who genuinely stood by you. As we walked through the venue, checking floral arrangements and seating charts, I felt a renewed sense of determination. This wedding would be unforgettable, not because of who came or didn't come, but because it would showcase the strength of standing by your convictions.
By late afternoon, the first guests began to arrive, and Ethan's nervous grin matched my own flutter of excitement. I caught his eye across the garden courtyard, and for the first time that day, the weight of my parents' rejection felt lighter. If anything, their absence would highlight the love and support we had cultivated in our own community, our friends, colleagues, and chosen family who truly understood the meaning of loyalty and celebration. I took a deep breath, adjusted my veil, and reminded myself that the day wasn't about proving anything to Margaret or Howard. It was about honoring the love Ethan and I had built together. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the hall, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. Owning the venue had always been a dream, but now it symbolized more than professional success. It was proof that even when the people you expect to support you the most withdraw their blessing, you have the power to create joy, beauty, and love on your own terms. I didn't know how Margaret and Howard would react if they showed up, or if they even would, but that uncertainty no longer intimidated me. This was my wedding, my day, and my victory. And deep down, I felt a flicker of anticipation, a sense that sometimes the universe rewards courage in the most unexpected ways. The hours leading up to the ceremony were a whirlwind of activity, but beneath the flurry of last-minute checks, my thoughts kept returning to my parents. I tried to push the resentment aside, focusing instead on Ethan and the community of friends and colleagues who had shown up to support us. Yet the tension was palpable in my chest every time I passed the main entrance of Magnolia Hall, imagining Margaret and Howard's judgmental eyes scanning the perfectly arranged garden, the pristine white chairs, and the meticulously lined aisle. It wasn't just about their absence. They had been a looming presence in my life for as long as I could remember, and the sting of disapproval was deep and persistent. My parents had always had a very particular vision of what success and propriety looked like, and anything outside of that box, especially in my personal life, had been met with criticism. Even as a child, I had learned to tread lightly, to manage expectations and toe the line between independence and obedience. But this was different. Now, as an adult with my own life, my own decisions, and my own values, I was facing the ultimate test of standing up for myself. I poured another cup of coffee in the small kitchenette backstage, trying to calm my nerves. Jennifer, my wedding planner, came in quietly, placing her hand on my shoulder. "You've got this, Claire," she said, her voice calm and steady, the kind of voice that could cut through a storm. I nodded, though I could feel my stomach twisting into knots. She knew exactly what this meant. She had been witness to my parents' subtle but persistent disapproval over the years, the cold comments during family dinners, the lectures about marrying well. It had been a shadow over my happiness for as long as I could remember. But the difference now was that I had a choice, and I was no longer willing to let them dictate my life. The room I had created, every archway, every flower, every light fixture, it was a reflection of my vision, my taste, my labor. It was proof that I could create something beautiful, regardless of anyone's approval. As I moved to check on the floral arrangements one last time, my mind wandered to Ethan. He had been nothing but supportive, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that my parents stirred in me. I remember when we first started dating, and I had told him about my family's high expectations and the constant pressure to conform. He had simply smiled, squeezed my hand, and told me that he loved me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. It had been a revelation. The first time I truly felt the weight of my own freedom and choice. I realize now that this wedding, this day that had been meticulously planned down to the last detail, was not only a celebration of our love, but a statement, a declaration that I would no longer be bound by the shadows of someone else's approval. By mid-afternoon, the venue was nearly full. Friends, extended family, colleagues from my event business, and neighbors from the community had begun to trickle in. Each face was a reminder of the network of support I had built, independent of my parents. As I walked through the garden, greeting guests, I noticed a few curious glances toward the entrance, the subtle whispers of, "Are they coming?" or, "Do you think her parents will show?" I answered politely, offering reassurances without revealing the deep fissure beneath my smile. The tension of my parents' rejection lingered, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It had become fuel, propelling me forward to make this day as extraordinary as I had always dreamed.
Even as I greeted my guests, my phone continued to buzz intermittently, reminders from vendors, last-minute coordination from Jennifer, and the occasional text from family members unsure of where they stood. My younger cousin Sophie sent a message full of excitement. "Can't wait to see you walk down the aisle. Ignore them. This is about you and Ethan." That simple text made me pause and reflect on the difference between those who truly cared and those who demanded control. My parents, by their absence, were revealing more about themselves than about me. Their insistence that I stay away, their judgment over choices that brought me genuine happiness, highlighted the distance between the values I wanted to live by and the values they insisted I follow. It was a painful revelation, but also liberating. I was learning in real time that sometimes people's rejection isn't a reflection of your worth, but of their own inability to accept authenticity. I found a quiet moment near the veranda, the soft afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees, and allowed myself a deep breath. Memories of childhood, birthday parties, summer picnics, quiet evenings reading together, flooded back, mingled with the harsher lessons of judgment and expectation. I realized how much courage it had taken to get to this point, how much of myself I had to fight for over the years to reach a place where I could stand firmly in my own truth. And yet I felt proud. Proud not just of the wedding I had organized, but of the boundaries I had set, the decisions I had made, and the life I had created with Ethan. Magnolia Hall wasn't just a venue. It was a symbol of independence, resilience, and the ability to transform rejection into something beautiful. As the ceremony time drew closer, the energy in the air shifted. Guests began to take their seats, chatter softened into anticipation, and the soft notes of the string quartet echoed through the garden. Jennifer gave me a reassuring nod, signaling that everything was in place, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. This day had started with a devastating message, one that could have defined the trajectory of my emotions and clouded the experience entirely. But I had chosen differently. I had chosen to honor my love, my commitment, and my values above the opinions of others. My parents' absence would be felt, yes, but it would not define the joy, beauty, and significance of what was about to unfold. I straightened my posture, smoothed the front of my dress, and stepped toward the entrance where Ethan waited. In that moment, the garden wasn't just a venue. It was a sanctuary. Each flower, each beam of sunlight, each carefully arranged table represented years of hard work, dreams, and perseverance. And as I prepared to walk down the aisle, I understood fully that this day, this moment, was not just a wedding, but a reclamation of agency, a testament to the power of love, and a quiet but firm statement that the life I chose to build with Ethan was mine and mine alone. The ceremony was about to begin, and a nervous excitement buzzed through the air like electricity. I could hear the faint rustle of dresses and the shuffle of shoes on the stone pathway as guests found their seats, and the soft murmur of anticipation whispered through Magnolia Hall's sunlit garden. I took a deep breath, clutching my bouquet tightly, trying to center myself in the whirlwind of emotion.
Everything had been planned to perfection. The linens, the lighting, the subtle scent of jasmine carried on the breeze. But despite the beauty surrounding me, an undercurrent of anxiety tugged at my chest. This wasn't just pre-wedding nerves, it was the unresolved tension of knowing my parents were deliberately absent. I had expected disappointment, yes, but the cold clarity of their decision to text me with that final cutting message still resonated in my mind. It was a brutal reminder that some people refuse to be part of your joy, no matter how hard you try to include them. Jennifer, ever the calm presence, guided me toward the veranda where the aisle began. "It's your moment," she said softly, brushing a stray strand of hair behind my ear. I nodded, but my thoughts were elsewhere. How had we arrived here? I thought back to the last family gathering, a lavish holiday dinner at my parents' mansion, where Ethan and I had been quietly berated for our lack of social polish and adherence to tradition. That had been the turning point, the moment when I realized that no amount of compromise or deference would satisfy Margaret and Howard. The realization had stung, but it had also ignited a spark within me. They wanted me to shrink into a version of myself that conformed to their rigid expectations. But today, I was refusing. Today, I would step into the life I had chosen, with the person I loved, and in the space I had created for us, on my own terms.
The first notes of the string quartet filled the air, soft and melodic, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. Guests turned their attention to the aisle, and I felt Ethan's hand squeeze mine with a quiet reassurance. My heart raced as I took my first step forward, the delicate train of my dress trailing behind me like a ribbon of determination. The sunlight caught the crystal accents in my hair, casting tiny prisms of light across the courtyard. And for a moment, I let myself breathe in the beauty of it all. I could feel the collective warmth of the people who had chosen to be here, their smiles and supportive glances surrounding us like a shield against the absence of my parents. And yet, beneath that warmth lingered a tension that I couldn't ignore. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this day would not pass without confrontation. Somehow, their absence, their disapproval, would demand acknowledgement. Just as I reached the halfway point down the aisle, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a detail I had hoped to ignore during the ceremony. I hesitated, but something compelled me to glance at the screen. It was a message from Howard, my father. "Claire, this is a mistake. Leave the venue now." My stomach dropped. The words were curt, authoritative, and laced with the same icy control he had wielded my entire life. The timing was not coincidental. They wanted to assert dominance even as the wedding unfolded. I felt a rush of adrenaline, anger, and disbelief all at once. My first instinct was to retreat, to obey, to avoid confrontation. But as I looked around at the faces of my guests, at Ethan waiting for me at the altar with a look of unwavering love and trust, I realized that retreat was no longer an option. This was my choice, my moment, and it was now or never to step fully into the life I wanted. I stopped mid-aisle, the sunlight warming my face, and took a steadying breath. Ethan's eyes met mine, and I could see the same mixture of fear and resolve mirrored there. It was a silent acknowledgement that we were in this together, that no outside force, not even our own families, could dictate the path of our love. I made a conscious decision to leave the message unread, to step into the ceremony fully present, to reclaim control over my emotions and over the narrative that had been so aggressively imposed on me. Each step I took toward Ethan was an act of defiance, an assertion that my happiness would not be compromised by someone else's narrow definitions of propriety or prestige. As I reached the altar, I could feel the energy shift in the garden. There was a quiet electricity, the kind that only comes when a community collectively witnesses a defining moment. The officiant smiled warmly at us, sensing the heightened emotions, and began the ceremony with a tone that felt intimate, grounding, and profoundly respectful. The vows Ethan and I exchanged were heartfelt, infused with humor, tenderness, and raw honesty. I couldn't help but glance at the audience, noting the tearful smiles of friends, the proud nods of colleagues, and even the cautious expressions of some distant relatives who had expected drama. Their presence was a reminder that love, authenticity, and connection often transcend family expectations, and that choosing your own path doesn't mean you walk it alone. Yet, despite the beauty unfolding, a part of me could not shake the tension of the messages that continued to arrive from my parents. They were relentless, insisting that I abandon the ceremony, undermining everything I had built and worked for. But as I looked at Ethan, at the venue I had painstakingly restored and curated, I felt a fierce resolve harden within me. This was my moment. Their control ended here. Magnolia Hall, with its sun-dappled courtyard, its carefully pruned gardens, and its centuries-old charm, was a testament to my ability to create, to persevere, and to claim joy in the face of opposition. And today it would witness not only our love, but the triumph of courage and self-determination over fear and manipulation. By the time the ceremony concluded, and the string quartet played the final notes, I was no longer just a bride walking down the aisle. I was a woman who had chosen her own path, who had confronted rejection and emerged empowered. The initial sting of my parents' absence had transformed into a quiet, undeniable pride. Their decision to turn away had been painful, but it had also illuminated the strength of the bonds I had built with the people who truly mattered. And as Ethan and I shared our first kiss as husband and wife, framed by the golden light of the late afternoon sun, I realized something profound. The day wasn't about their approval at all. It was about seizing the life I had fought for and claiming the love I deserved, regardless of who chose to support it.
As the reception began, the energy in Magnolia Hall shifted from nervous anticipation to jubilant celebration. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the rich aroma of catered dishes, laughter and conversation bouncing off the high ceilings, and the soft notes of the live band carrying through the courtyard. It was everything I had dreamed of, and yet, beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension remained, tethered to the unresolved situation with my parents. Their absence wasn't just noticeable. It was a quiet, pressing weight, and I could feel it lingering in the corners of the room. But then something unexpected happened. An outside perspective began to crystallize the significance of their rejection. My father's business partner, Mr. Clark, a longtime friend of the family who had been invited out of obligation more than personal warmth, approached me cautiously as I passed the bar to grab a glass of champagne. His expression was serious, tinged with concern. "Claire," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I don't know if you're aware, but your parents, they've been telling people not to attend. They've made it very clear they want to isolate you from this event." The words hit harder than I expected. I had known, of course, that Margaret and Howard were attempting to wield their influence over our wedding, but hearing it confirmed by an outsider made the situation tangible, undeniable. It was no longer speculation or fear. It was fact. For a moment, I felt my composure waver, the old familiar surge of anxiety creeping in. But then I looked around at the guests, the ones who had shown up not because of family obligation, but because of genuine care and love. Their presence was tangible proof that my life was larger than the narrow expectations imposed by my parents. I felt a wave of determination wash over me. This was the point of no return. Whatever drama they tried to stir, whatever social games they attempted to play, could no longer dictate my experience. I was fully in control of this day, my marriage, and my own happiness. After speaking with Mr. Clark, I found Ethan waiting near the dance floor. He had noticed the subtle shift in my expression and immediately came to my side. "What's going on?" he asked, concern knitting his brow. I explained the situation briefly, trying to keep my voice steady. His reaction was immediate and protective. "They can't take this from you," he said firmly. "This is our day, Claire. Let them talk. Let them gossip. What matters is right here." I nodded,
feeling the familiar swell of gratitude and love that had become the foundation of our relationship. Ethan's calm, steadfast presence had been a counterweight to the storm I had grown up navigating with my parents. In him, I found the courage to face the reality of their disapproval without letting it overshadow the joy of our day. Soon, whispers started circulating among the staff and some of the more observant guests. Someone had overheard a conversation between a few distant relatives, piecing together the truth about my parents' attempted to dissuade attendance. I could see it reflected in their expressions: sympathy, surprise, and, in some cases, quiet indignation. For the first time, the scope of my parents' actions became clear. They weren't just withdrawing themselves from the celebration, they were actively trying to manipulate the narrative, control the perceptions of others, and diminish the significance of the wedding. It was a betrayal that cut deep, but it also crystallized the reality I had been confronting all along. My parents' judgment was never about Ethan, the venue, or the ceremony. It was about control, about proving that their influence could dictate my life choices. And now, that influence had reached its limits. As the evening progressed, a turning point emerged that made the truth undeniable for everyone present. A close family friend, Mrs. Wainwright, who had been quietly observing the unfolding situation, took me aside. Her eyes were warm yet serious. "Claire," she said, "I just want you to know, people are talking. They're seeing how your parents have tried to interfere, and they're shocked. You've handled this with grace, but it's clear they're in the wrong." Hearing these words from someone so respected, someone who had long been part of Charleston's social circle, was both validating and empowering. The hidden dynamics that had burdened me for so long were finally coming into the open. It was no longer a private struggle or a silent rebellion. It was a visible, undeniable truth recognized by others who could witness it objectively. I realized that the external perspective was beginning to shift the entire narrative. The whispers of disapproval from my parents could no longer define the perception of the event. Guests, friends, and colleagues were now silently acknowledging the courage it took for me to stand firm. Each toast, each warm glance, each small gesture of support reinforced the reality that my parents' attempt to control had backfired. They had tried to diminish the celebration, but in doing so, they highlighted the strength, resilience, and authenticity of the life I had chosen. In that moment, the wedding became more than just a ceremony. It became a quiet victory, a testament to the power of truth, persistence, and the support of those who truly matter.
By the time dinner concluded, the energy in the room had transformed from tentative anticipation to a palpable sense of solidarity. People were approaching me, sharing stories of similar experiences, commending my composure, and expressing admiration for the way Ethan and I had navigated the tension. The more I listened, the more I realized that the ripple effect of my parents' absence was turning into a lesson, not just for me, but for everyone present. They were witnessing firsthand that courage, self-determination, and love could prevail even when powerful figures attempted to impose their will. It was a moment of collective acknowledgement, a confirmation that the truth of our choices could not be hidden or dismissed. As the night wore on, I caught sight of the empty seats where Margaret and Howard should have been. The absence still carried a sting, but it was now tempered with clarity. Their attempt to control the narrative had been exposed, and the support surrounding Ethan and me was a tangible testament to the strength of standing firm in one's convictions. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to feel a profound sense of liberation. The point of no return had been crossed. The truth of their behavior was evident to those around us, and nothing could diminish the significance of the love, commitment, and joy we were celebrating. Magnolia Hall had not only hosted a wedding, it had become the stage for an undeniable revelation of character, integrity, and resilience. The night had settled into a gentle hum of laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music drifting across the gardens of Magnolia Hall. But the undercurrents of tension from my parents' disapproval were far from gone. While most of the guests were immersed in celebration,
I could feel the invisible pressure pressing at the edges of the evening, a quiet, persistent reminder that Margaret and Howard's attempts to control my wedding had not gone unnoticed. It wasn't just the absence of my parents, it was the subtle, unspoken narratives they had tried to plant in the minds of others. Whispers of disapproval, veiled criticism, and the faint suggestion that this marriage somehow fell short of expectation. And now, as the night stretched on, I realized that their actions were drawing attention in a different way, a way that was building tension rather than diminishing the event. I was about to learn just how far their influence, or their opposition, could reach, and the consequences of standing my ground were about to intensify. It started subtly, with small questions from a few guests who had known my parents longer than they had known me. "Are they really not coming?" one asked, glancing nervously around the room. "I heard they were insisting no one should attend." I could feel the weight of their curiosity, the unspoken expectation that I would explain, justify, or even apologize. But I refused. This was my day, and my refusal to let them define it had already become a statement. Yet, as I navigated the crowded reception, I could sense that their attempt to manipulate the narrative was still at work. Some attendees exchanged looks, some murmured quietly, and a few hesitant family friends sought confirmation about what had happened. Their interest wasn't judgmental. It was curiosity tinged with concern. They were beginning to see that the situation was more complicated than a simple absence. They were seeing evidence of ongoing tension, subtle coercion, and the psychological weight I had carried for years. Jennifer noticed it too. She pulled me aside discreetly as I stepped out of the dining area to catch my breath. "Claire, people are starting to piece things together," she said, her voice low but urgent. "They're noticing the empty seats, the lack of parental involvement, and the messages you've been receiving. Some of them are whispering about it, trying to understand what's going on." I nodded, my pulse quickening. This was the first real sign that the private tension with my parents was transforming into public awareness. What had been a personal struggle was now emerging in front of witnesses who could see the truth, who could recognize that the obstacle wasn't me or my choices, but the stubborn interference of people who were meant to love and support me. Determined to reclaim the narrative, I returned to the dance floor, where Ethan was greeting some of the older guests with his usual warmth and calm assurance. His presence was grounding, a reminder that no matter how tense or uncomfortable the situation became, we were in this together. I could see the beginning of a subtle shift in the room. Guests who had initially looked unsure or curious were now quietly rallying around us, offering smiles, encouraging words, and shared laughter. It was a small but meaningful form of evidence that our choice to stand firm, to proceed with the wedding on our own terms, was being noticed and respected. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about transparency, about allowing the truth to emerge naturally through actions rather than arguments. By the time the first toasts began, the dynamics of the evening had shifted into a more tangible form. One of my closest friends, Marissa, rose with a glass of champagne in hand and began to speak. "Claire and Ethan," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we're all here because we love you and because we believe in the life you're building together. It's easy for outsiders to judge or try to impose expectations, but tonight, what matters is this room, filled with people who truly care." Her words struck a chord, echoing in the minds of the other guests, and it was clear that her acknowledgement was a form of gathering evidence, not of conflict, but of validation. Each supportive toast, each shared story, each nod of approval from the audience became a quiet collection of proof. The people who mattered understood and respected our choices, and they saw clearly the divide between support and imposed control. Yet, as the night unfolded, the opposition became more active in subtler ways. A few relatives sent indirect messages, expressing disapproval through veiled comments or concerned inquiries, attempting to sow doubt or second-guess decisions we had already made.
There was no dramatic confrontation yet, no overt intrusion, but the effort to undermine our day persisted, quietly and relentlessly. It was a reminder that the tension with my parents wasn't limited to direct interaction. It had a ripple effect, touching even those who wanted to remain neutral. But in the midst of these subtle challenges, I could feel an emerging clarity. Every action, every supportive gesture, every observation of the guests was beginning to tip the scales. The evidence of our resilience and independence was accumulating, quietly but undeniably. Toward the end of the evening, I took a moment to stand at the veranda, looking out over the softly lit garden, the twinkling lights reflecting off the glassware, the gentle murmur of conversation and laughter enveloping the space. It was a moment of reflection and acknowledgement. The opposition from my parents and the subtle pressures from others had not succeeded in overshadowing the day. Instead, it had highlighted our strength, our commitment, and the profound impact of love, integrity, and courage. The truth was now visible to anyone willing to look. This was a celebration of authenticity, resilience, and the power of standing firmly by one's choices, even in the face of familial disapproval. And as I turned back to the crowd, greeting friends and savoring the warmth of shared joy, I knew with absolute certainty that the rising opposition, the subtle questioning, and the challenges imposed by my parents were no longer threats. They were catalysts. Every whisper, every curious glance, every attempt at undermining had only added weight to the evidence that our love, our choices, and our day were worthy of recognition, respect, and celebration. The first pinch point had passed, but it had also strengthened our resolve, setting the stage for the undeniable revelations that were yet to come. The following morning brought a golden sunrise over Magnolia Hall, painting the garden in soft hues of amber and rose. The night's celebration had ended, but the echoes of tension from my parents' absence still lingered in my mind. I wandered through the courtyard, adjusting the last of the decorations that had been left in place for photographs, letting the morning light wash over the petals and polished wood. As beautiful as the setting was, I knew the real test of the wedding's significance wasn't in the decor, the linens, or even the flawless catering. It was in the undeniable truth of what had transpired the day before. Slowly, clarity began to emerge. The world had witnessed the contrast between those who genuinely celebrated our love and those who had attempted to undermine it, and that evidence was now concrete, impossible to dispute. The first proof arrived in an unexpected form: photographs. Our photographer, Simone, had captured every detail of the day, from the intimate exchange of vows to the laughter of friends and family, to the way Ethan's eyes lit up when I walked down the aisle. But woven among the joyful images were subtle visual cues that told the story of my parents' absence. Empty chairs where they should have been, the subtle glances of guests towards the entrance, the supportive gestures exchanged between those who had attended in their place. Every image became a testament to the reality that Margaret and Howard had chosen to exclude themselves from a moment that mattered more than their pride. Seeing the photographs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sorrow for their absence, anger at the years of imposed judgment, and a profound sense of triumph that the truth was now visually undeniable. Soon, the reactions of our guests began to reinforce the evidence. Messages started arriving, some expressing gratitude for being part of such an authentic celebration, others marveling at how gracefully we had handled a situation that could have easily become a public spectacle. One particularly touching note came from Mrs. Wainwright, the respected family friend who had noticed the subtle dynamics the night before. She wrote, "Claire, your strength and poise yesterday were remarkable. Everyone could see how your parents' attempts to control the narrative only highlighted your courage and love for Ethan. The truth is clear." I reread her words several times, feeling a swell of validation unlike anything I had experienced. For years, the emotional weight of my parents' judgment had been carried silently, and now, at last, the clarity of truth was indisputable, recognized by outsiders whose perspectives carried weight and credibility. Even the social media updates from friends who had attended contributed to the undeniable proof. Photos, tagged with cheerful captions, stories of the heartfelt toasts, and candid images of laughter and joy filled the feeds.
The contrast between the visible joy of those who attended and the conspicuous absence of my parents painted a picture that was unmistakably clear. Anyone who attempted to downplay or distort the narrative would find it impossible to do so convincingly. The evidence was everywhere, in the smiles, in the gestures of support, and in the documentation of a day that had been carried out with grace, dignity, and love despite attempts to interfere. As the morning wore on, Ethan and I met with Simone to review the highlights from the day. Each photograph was a piece of undeniable truth, but it was more than just visual documentation. It was the story of resilience captured in real time. I pointed to an image of the empty chairs at the front of the ceremony, framed by the sunlight filtering through the trees. "Look at this," I said softly, my voice steady but emotional. "You can't fake this absence. You can't stage the truth that they weren't here to support us." Ethan nodded, his expression a mix of admiration and relief. "It's perfect," he said. "This is exactly what people need to see. It's not about shaming them, it's about showing the reality, and it's crystal clear." Later, during a follow-up brunch with some of the closest friends and family who had attended, the discussion inevitably turned to Margaret and Howard. Their actions were dissected, analyzed, and contextualized in a way that left little room for denial. The consensus was unanimous. The couple had chosen to step away from the celebration, and their absence spoke volumes about their inability to prioritize love and support over ego and control. The more people discussed it, the more the truth solidified in everyone's minds. There was no ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation. It was impossible to dispute the clarity of the events. Our day had been beautiful, joyous, and authentic, and any attempts to diminish it had been transparently revealed. By late afternoon, I felt a profound shift in my own perspective as well. The undeniable proof of my parents' absence, juxtaposed with the overwhelming support we had received, had transformed the emotional landscape. What had begun as a source of pain and anxiety was now a catalyst for empowerment. I realized that the evidence wasn't just about proving my parents wrong, it was about acknowledging the resilience and love that Ethan and I had cultivated. It was about understanding that the validation of our choices, our marriage, and our life together didn't need to come from those who refused to support us. The truth was visible, verifiable, and undeniable. And that realization brought a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible after years of tension. As the day came to a close, I walked alone through the gardens, the soft evening breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and roses. The photographs, the messages, and the stories from the brunch had crystallized a truth that no absence, no judgment, and no attempt at manipulation could ever erase. Our love was valid, our decisions were right, and our day had been a triumph. Magnolia Hall, in all its beauty and meticulous care, had borne witness to this undeniable proof, capturing a moment in time that would forever affirm our courage, resilience, and the power of standing firm in the face of opposition. I smiled, feeling lighter, freer, and more certain than ever that the truth, once revealed, cannot be ignored or denied. Despite the undeniable proof of support from friends, family, and even acquaintances who had quietly witnessed the events of the wedding, I found that the emotional weight of my parents' absence had not fully lifted. In the quiet moments after the brunch, I felt a gnawing sense of incompleteness, as if the shadow of their rejection still lingered, whispering that something was missing, that their approval or lack thereof still mattered. It was a paradoxical tension. The world could see the truth, the photographs and testimonials confirmed it, and yet the hollow space where their presence should have been still ached. As I sat in the sunlit parlor of Magnolia Hall, holding a cup of lukewarm tea, I realized that the next step would require me to confront not only my parents' disapproval, but also the lingering internalized fear that their judgment had instilled in me over the years. It was time for the second plot point, the moment where I would stop shielding myself and step fully into my truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. The catalyst came unexpectedly, in the form of a phone call. My cousin, Sophie, who had been quietly supportive throughout the entire ordeal, called me with a tone that mixed concern and urgency. "Claire, you need to talk to them. They're spreading rumors.
People are asking questions, and it's getting messy. You can't just let them control the story. I listened, the words stirring a storm inside me. Part of me wanted to retreat, to let the situation fade quietly into memory, to maintain the peace at the expense of my own integrity. But as I thought about Ethan, about the friends and family who had celebrated our union without hesitation, and about the truth that had been laid bare in every photograph and every heartfelt message, I realized that silence was no longer an option. Protecting them or avoiding confrontation would only perpetuate the cycle of control. It was time to speak, to act, and to claim my narrative fully.
I drafted a message carefully, pausing with every sentence to balance clarity, assertiveness, and honesty. I told them how their actions had affected me, how their attempt to manipulate the event had been seen and understood by everyone who mattered, and how their choice to exclude themselves had not diminished the significance of my wedding. It had only highlighted the resilience, love, and courage that Ethan and I embodied. I explained, in no uncertain terms, that their absence had been felt, their attempts at control recognized, and that moving forward, I would no longer allow their opinions to dictate my choices or my happiness. Sending the message felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I anticipated their anger, defensiveness, and perhaps a refusal to engage, but I also recognized that the cost of not speaking, continuing to carry the weight of their disapproval silently, was far greater than any confrontation could be. When the message was sent, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't immediate relief or vindication, it was the quiet strength that comes from doing the right thing, from refusing to compromise integrity for fear of conflict. I could no longer protect them from the consequences of their choices, nor could I ignore the impact those choices had on my own life. In that moment, I felt fully aligned with my values, empowered by the support of Ethan and everyone who had celebrated the wedding with authenticity. My parents' judgment had been a shadow over my life for decades, but now, for the first time, I was standing in the light, unafraid of confrontation and unbound by their expectations. As the hours passed, their responses arrived. Howard first, in a terse, clipped message that attempted to minimize his actions, followed by Margaret, who oscillated between defensiveness and thinly veiled guilt. Neither could deny what had been witnessed, and both were confronted, explicitly, with the undeniable proof that their attempts to control the event had been ineffective. I read their messages carefully, resisting the temptation to react emotionally, and instead choosing a measured, firm reply that reiterated my boundaries and my intentions. It was not about punishment or revenge, it was about clarity, integrity, and ensuring that the narrative of my life was shaped by my choices, not theirs. By the late afternoon, I felt a transformative shift within myself. The fear of disappointing them, the ingrained habit of seeking approval, and the long-standing anxiety that had accompanied family interactions were all beginning to dissolve. I had made the conscious choice to speak, to claim my truth, and to confront the dynamics that had held me captive for so long. The decision was both empowering and humbling, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. As I walked through the garden, the late sunlight reflecting off the polished tables and the lingering flowers from the previous night, I realized that this was a turning point in more than just the wedding. It was a turning point in my life. I had chosen authenticity over fear, love over obligation, and self-respect over imposed expectation. That evening, Ethan and I sat together on the veranda, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The conversation was quiet, reflective, and filled with a sense of accomplishment that transcended the beauty of the wedding day. "You did it," he said softly, squeezing my hand. "You finally stopped carrying it all alone." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief and empowerment. Speaking the truth had not been easy, and the confrontation had been uncomfortable, but it was necessary. The point of no return had been crossed, the silence broken, and the unshakable reality of my own agency had been claimed. For the first time, I felt completely unburdened by the weight of others' expectations and fully aligned with the life I had chosen to create. As darkness fell over Magnolia Hall, I understood the significance of this moment.
The second plot point, the decision to fully speak the truth, was not just about confronting my parents, it was about reclaiming my voice, my power, and my story. The choice to act, to stand firm, and to communicate boundaries and expectations clearly had set the stage for the next phase, confronting opposition, navigating lingering tension, and ultimately arriving at a resolution that was both just and empowering. It was a declaration that the truth, once spoken, could no longer be denied, ignored, or manipulated, and that courage, love, and authenticity would always prevail when chosen consciously. The morning after sending my message, the atmosphere shifted from quiet reflection to tense anticipation. I had hoped that asserting my boundaries and stating my truth would bring closure, but the reality was more complicated. Margaret and Howard were not willing to accept the situation without a fight, and it became clear that they were preparing a confrontation, albeit indirect, that would test my resolve in ways I hadn't yet experienced. As I walked through Magnolia Hall, checking details for a small post-wedding brunch, my phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from relatives and acquaintances, forwarding texts from my parents that were thinly veiled accusations and attempts to manipulate perception. The subtleties of their words were infuriating, framed as concern, but clearly intended to provoke doubt and guilt. It was a direct challenge, a mounting pressure that demanded not only composure, but strategy. I understood with a quiet clarity that this was the second pinch point, the confrontation with the antagonist, where the tension was personal, direct, and unavoidable. Ethan noticed my furrowed brow as I read through the messages and gently took the phone from my hands. "Claire, we need to approach this calmly. They're trying to intimidate you, but the truth is already clear," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. I nodded, taking a deep breath. His presence reminded me that while they could escalate, the ultimate power rested with those who had lived the truth and stood firm in it. I began drafting careful responses, not out of fear, but out of necessity, to confront deception with facts, to redirect manipulation into clarity, and to ensure that no further false narratives would take root. Each sentence I typed felt like laying another brick in the wall of our integrity, a tangible reinforcement of the truth that had already begun to manifest publicly through the wedding, photographs, and guest testimony. By mid-morning, the confrontation escalated in a more public form. My cousin Sophie, trying to mediate, inadvertently acted as a messenger. She relayed a conversation from Howard, who had spoken to several distant relatives, attempting to rewrite the story. He insisted that our planning had been improper, that we had ignored tradition, and that our friends had somehow misrepresented the day. It was a calculated effort to discredit the celebration and reassert control over the narrative. I felt a familiar tension rise in my chest, the impulse to shrink back and placate threatening me momentarily. But then I reminded myself of the tangible proof, the photos, the messages of support, the visible joy of our guests. Each piece of evidence was undeniable, and it fortified me against the intimidation tactics being used. I realized that this confrontation, while uncomfortable, was necessary. It would either break me or solidify the truth in a way that could never be erased. Determined, I called an impromptu meeting with a few key guests who had witnessed the events firsthand, including Mrs. Wainwright and Marisa. We gathered in the small parlor of Magnolia Hall, reviewing images, recounting moments from the ceremony, and articulating exactly what had transpired. As we spoke, a sense of empowerment began to grow. The collective testimony and visual proof made it impossible for any distortion to succeed. The confrontation from my parents was no longer a shadowy threat, but a challenge that could be met with clarity and consistency. By documenting and discussing the events openly, we transformed mounting pressure into undeniable validation. Each participant in that meeting became a witness, not only to our joy, but to the deliberate efforts of Margaret and Howard to undermine it. By the afternoon, the confrontation intensified further. Howard had arranged for a formal phone call with me, ostensibly to discuss family concerns. I took a deep breath before answering, aware that this conversation could spiral into guilt-tripping or emotional manipulation.
The call began predictably. Accusations disguised as concern, repeated attempts to diminish the wedding and my choices, and veiled threats about social repercussions. But I had prepared for this. Calmly, I responded point by point, recounting the facts, referencing messages, photographs, and the public support that had accumulated. Each statement I made was deliberate, unyielding, and grounded in evidence. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of empowerment. I was no longer negotiating for approval or fearing reprisal. I was standing in the light of truth, confronting deception head-on. Margaret's voice, though strained with frustration, attempted a softer approach, switching between guilt-laden appeals and condescending explanations. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that their attempts to intimidate were failing. Each time I calmly reaffirmed our boundaries and highlighted the documented evidence, their arguments weakened. The confrontation, intended to assert dominance and control, had inadvertently revealed their own rigidity and inability to accept reality. By facing them directly, armed with undeniable truth, I had shifted the dynamic entirely. I was no longer the vulnerable child. I was a woman whose life, choices, and happiness were no longer subject to their manipulation. By evening, the confrontation had reached its peak. Messages continued, phone calls attempted, subtle attempts to pressure mutual acquaintances, but the tide had shifted irrevocably. Friends and family who had witnessed the events were quietly reinforcing the narrative, ensuring that Margaret and Howard's distortions would carry no weight. And as Ethan and I watched the sun set over the hall, the pressure that seemed insurmountable that morning began to dissolve. What had started as a tense, direct confrontation with mounting stakes had transformed into an unambiguous affirmation of truth. Our choice to face it openly, calmly, and with evidence turned intimidation into empowerment, deception into transparency, and conflict into a lesson in resilience. That night, as the lights of Magnolia Hall glimmered softly against the dark sky, I reflected on the confrontation. It was a turning point. A moment when the lies and manipulations could no longer hold sway, and when the power of truth, integrity, and courage became undeniable. The second pinch point had tested me, but it had also solidified my confidence, reinforcing the lesson that facing opposition directly with calm resolve and clear evidence transforms fear into strength and confrontation into clarity. The stage was now set for the next act, the dark night of the soul, when the true emotional consequences of speaking the truth would demand reckoning, and the true test of resilience would reveal itself.
The days that followed the confrontation with my parents brought an unexpected weight that neither photographs nor supportive messages could fully lift. While the undeniable proof of the wedding's success and our circle's validation had been empowering, the emotional aftermath, the dark night of the soul, settled over me with relentless intensity. It began subtly, with lingering doubt and exhaustion that crept into every quiet moment, as though the confrontation had peeled back a protective layer and left me vulnerable to the emotional fallout I had long tried to suppress. Despite my knowledge of the truth, I felt the familiar pangs of inadequacy and guilt. Questions like, did I overstep? Did I push too hard? Will they ever forgive me? Hovering at the edges of my mind. The conflict that had once been external now pressed inward, forcing me to confront not just my parents' disapproval, but the internalized expectations I had carried for years. Even Ethan, as calm and supportive as he had always been, noticed the change. One evening, he came to sit beside me on the veranda, where the twilight stretched across Magnolia Hall in long, melancholy shadows. "Claire, you've done everything you can," he said softly. "You've faced them directly. You've made your choices clear. The rest isn't on you." I nodded, grateful for his reassurance, but I could feel the emotional toll manifesting physically. Tightness in my chest, sleepless nights, and the sudden irritability that came from constant vigilance. The confrontation had opened old wounds, forcing me to relive years of emotional manipulation and subtle criticism that I had worked so hard to leave behind. The clarity I had gained only amplified the pain, because while the truth was now visible to the world, the absence of parental recognition still cut deeply. The emotional low point became more apparent during a brunch with a few extended family members who had attended the wedding. While they offered congratulations and kind words, the conversation inevitably circled back to Margaret and Howard. Despite our calm explanations and the evidence we presented, some relatives expressed confusion or mild criticism, suggesting that perhaps our handling of the situation had been too harsh. Each comment, though minor, felt like a reopening of the wound. It was a reminder that even when the truth is undeniable, the personal cost of confronting deep-seated familial expectations can be high. I felt isolated in that room, not because of their words, but because the emotional resonance of my parents' disapproval had not yet fully dissipated. It was a stark, uncomfortable realization that speaking the truth sometimes comes with consequences that are not immediately visible or measurable. The physical manifestations of stress compounded the emotional burden. I noticed my appetite fluctuating, my energy levels dipping unexpectedly, and a lingering tension in my shoulders and jaw that made every movement feel heavier than usual. Even moments of joy were tinged with anxiety, as if the absence of approval from those who should have loved me unconditionally was an unspoken weight pressing against my ribs. I tried to articulate this to Ethan, to explain the mixture of empowerment and despair I felt, but even the words felt insufficient. The realization that standing up for oneself, while right and necessary, could exact such a toll was humbling and in many ways terrifying. I had expected conflict, but not this depth of internal struggle, a reminder that the consequences of truth-telling are often as psychological and emotional as they are social. One afternoon, seeking solitude and clarity, I wandered through the gardens of Magnolia Hall, letting the sun warm my face and listening to the quiet rustle of leaves. It was there that I faced the full scope of the low point, the understanding that no external validation could completely heal the years of emotional conditioning I had endured. Margaret and Howard's absence, their attempts to control the narrative, and the subtle insinuations that lingered among certain relatives had all converged into a moment of raw vulnerability. I realized that true courage wasn't just about facing others, it was about facing oneself, confronting the lingering fears, insecurities, and internalized judgments that had been passed down through generations. The recognition of this truth was sobering, almost paralyzing, yet it was also the first step towards authentic empowerment. By evening, I had begun to reach a tentative reconciliation with my emotions, understanding that the dark night of the soul was not a sign of weakness, but a necessary stage in the journey. Alone in the hall, I reviewed the photographs, reread the messages of support, and reflected on the courage it had taken to confront my parents directly. The evidence of truth remained indisputable, but the personal cost was now clearer than ever. I understood that the battle was not only against their manipulation, but also against the internalized belief that I needed their approval to feel validated. That internal confrontation was the most difficult and exhausting part of all, standing firm in the truth while acknowledging the lingering wounds that could not be erased instantly. The night ended with me sitting quietly on the veranda, Ethan beside me, the soft glow of Magnolia Hall's lights reflecting in the glass of the nearby windows. The dark night of the soul had reached its peak, a crucible of emotional, psychological, and physical strain. Yet even in the depths of that struggle, a subtle strength emerged, a recognition that pain and resilience often coexist, that the cost of truth is sometimes steep, and that the journey towards empowerment is rarely linear. Though the consequences were raw and the fallout intense, I knew that I had survived the lowest point and that the stage was being set for the final push, the moment when truth would be fully affirmed and publicly validated.
The day of reckoning arrived quietly but unmistakably, as if the universe itself had marked a turning point. While the wedding had been a celebration of love, the aftermath had become a battleground for truth, a test of character that extended far beyond the walls of Magnolia Hall. Invitations had been sent to a broader circle of relatives, community members, and close family friends for a post-celebration gathering framed as a simple brunch. But in reality, it was the stage for the final push, the public validation of truth that would leave no room for distortion or denial. I spent the morning walking through the hall, arranging flowers, and ensuring every detail was impeccable. But beneath the practical tasks was a pulse of anticipation, a quiet tension that thrummed in my chest. This wasn't about confrontation alone. It was about asserting clarity, evidence, and moral authority in the face of lingering manipulation. When guests began to arrive, the energy in the room was different from the festive chaos of the wedding. There was purpose, attentiveness, and quiet observation. Whispers circulated, acknowledging that the gathering had a unique significance beyond social pleasantries. Margaret and Howard, aware that they could not ignore the event without losing face entirely, arrived with their characteristic airs of control. But the difference was stark. They were no longer shaping the narrative. They were responding to it. As I greeted friends and extended family, I could feel the weight of history and expectation pressing into the room. Every glance, every subtle gesture was loaded with scrutiny. And yet, amid that tension, I felt a remarkable clarity and focus, a sense that the truth finally had an audience ready to witness it fully. The confrontation began naturally, as a few supportive relatives initiated discussion referencing the wedding day, the photos, and the heartfelt toasts. Their words were deliberate but measured, recounting details that were publicly visible and undeniably true. Claire and Ethan's day was beautiful, and the absence of certain family members was noticed. Mrs. Wainwright began, her voice calm but firm. It's clear that the couple took every measure to honor tradition while celebrating their love authentically. Each statement, though seemingly innocuous, carried weight. It framed the reality for anyone who had doubts or had been influenced by hearsay. Margaret's expression tightened, and Howard shifted in his seat, realizing that this was not a setting for manipulation, but a forum where facts, observation, and witness testimony held authority. I chose that moment to speak, standing quietly yet confidently, my voice steady, projecting not anger but clarity. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, scanning the room for familiar supportive faces. "I know that some of you have heard different versions of what happened during our wedding and the events leading up to it. I want to be clear. Every decision we made, every plan we executed, and every choice regarding guests and participation was deliberate, informed, and rooted in love. There were attempts to undermine the celebration, and while I deeply wish my parents could have been here in support, their actions are now part of the record, visible to all who attended and documented." The room was silent, absorbing the statement, and I could see the shift as people nodded, murmuring quietly, acknowledging the courage it took to articulate this publicly. Howard attempted to interject, his voice firm but slightly wavering. "Claire, But I raised a hand gently, maintaining control of the room. "I appreciate your perspective," I said, calm and deliberate, "but the truth is already evident. The photographs, the toasts, and the support of our guests provide an accurate record of what occurred. No further distortion is necessary." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer excuses or express guilt, but the statements from witnesses continued, layering affirmation upon affirmation. Cousin Sophie shared observations, recounting moments of heartfelt interaction and joy that could not be fabricated, while Marissa detailed the unspoken gestures of support that had carried the day beyond the reach of manipulation. It became clear the truth was on trial, and the evidence was unassailable. By the midpoint of the gathering, the tension in the room had shifted decisively. What had begun as a test of courage and clarity had transformed into a public acknowledgement of our agency, choices, and authenticity. Margaret and Howard were confronted by the reality of their absence and the documentation of events they had attempted to influence. Each piece of evidence presented, whether photographic, testimonial, or visual, reinforced the narrative I had already laid out privately and emotionally in the days following the wedding. There was no ambiguity left to exploit, no subtlety in interpretation, and no plausible deniability. The truth was undeniable, and it was now witnessed and validated by all present. As I concluded my statement, Ethan stood beside me, his quiet presence a steady reminder of shared strength and unwavering partnership. "This is not about blame," I added softly, turning slightly to include my parents in the acknowledgement, "but about recognizing what is real and what is visible. Our love, our day, and our community of support are the facts. They cannot be rewritten, denied, or minimized." The room exhaled collectively, an almost tangible relief that the truth had been formally acknowledged and that the narrative of control and disapproval had been definitively addressed. Margaret and Howard remained, visibly tense but subdued, their attempts to assert authority finally neutralized by evidence, witness testimony, and the courage to speak the truth openly.
By the time the gathering drew to a close, a profound sense of validation and peace had settled over Magnolia Hall. Friends and family lingered, expressing support and admiration for the clarity and courage demonstrated, while my parents departed quietly, their presence now neutralized in the face of the incontrovertible truth. I felt a sense of triumph that went beyond victory. It was the culmination of months, years, and even decades of restraint, courage, and steadfastness in the face of manipulation. The public acknowledgement of truth combined with the tangible evidence and witness support had transformed anxiety and confrontation into empowerment, setting the stage for resolution, vindication, and ultimately personal and familial transformation. The days after the post-wedding gathering brought a rare sense of calm, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence that had preceded it. The truth had been laid bare, witnessed, and validated in a manner that could no longer be ignored or disputed. And with that recognition came a subtle but profound shift in the energy surrounding Magnolia Hall and our lives. While Margaret and Howard remained distant and somewhat defensive and private, the social consequences of their actions became apparent almost immediately. Friends and relatives who had initially been uncertain or hesitant began to treat the situation with clarity, acknowledging both the courage it had taken to confront the disapproval and the authenticity of our choices. Their whispers of doubt had evaporated, replaced by admiration and understanding. I watched, quietly, as a sense of justice took root. Not a vindictive justice, but one that simply recognized truth and upheld it publicly. One of the first tangible signs of this new equilibrium was the sudden influx of messages from family, friends, and acquaintances who had observed the wedding from a distance, hearing conflicting narratives. Each message reinforced the reality of what had occurred, praising our composure, resilience, and integrity in the face of adversity. Mrs. Wainwright sent a particularly moving note. "Claire, the way you handled your parents' absence, the confrontation, and the validation of truth is remarkable. You have set a standard for honesty, courage, and grace that others will remember and learn from." Reading her words, I felt a swell of gratitude, not just for the affirmation, but for the acknowledgement that standing firmly in truth could inspire and influence others beyond the immediate circle of witnesses. The validation extended far beyond our expectations, reinforcing that courage and integrity, once exercised, have a ripple effect that reaches into communities and relationships in ways that cannot be measured immediately. Ethan and I began to see subtle shifts in the behavior of our extended family. While Margaret and Howard continued to maintain their distance, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Their attempts to shape perception and exert control over social circles were effectively neutralized by evidence, witnesses, and the clarity of the public confrontation. It was no longer possible for them to dominate narratives or insinuate judgment without exposure. The truth had become the default reality, supported by a network of observation and affirmation. In many ways, their absence had cemented the strength of our position, demonstrating that courage and integrity carry more weight than fear and manipulation ever could. This newfound equilibrium extended into our daily lives as well.
the emotional burden that had previously loomed over me, resentment, guilt, and lingering anxiety, began to dissipate. I noticed for the first time in years that I could engage with relatives and friends without the constant subconscious fear of judgment or disapproval. Decisions that might have previously felt fraught with the potential for conflict or criticism were now approached with confidence and clarity. The wedding had been more than a celebration of love. It had been a crucible through which both Ethan and I had solidified our sense of agency, and the after effects were tangible in the way we moved through life unburdened by the need for external validation. Even in professional contexts, the ripple effects were evident. Magnolia Hall, now recognized not only as a beautiful venue, but also as the site of a remarkable story of resilience and integrity, became a point of admiration and recommendation. Colleagues, clients, and friends frequently remarked on the grace, courage, and meticulous planning that had carried the wedding, reinforcing the sense that the consequences of truth-telling extended beyond personal relationships into social and professional influence. What had begun as a private struggle had evolved into public recognition of both character and competence, a validation that had far-reaching implications for self-esteem and confidence. The most personal form of vindication, however, came in quieter moments. Ethan and I would sit together in the late evenings, recounting the events with a mix of reflection and humor, understanding that our bond had been strengthened not simply by the wedding, but by the resilience we had demonstrated in the face of opposition. There was no need for triumphalism or gloating. The sense of justice was inherent in the clarity of truth itself. It was evident that courage and integrity do not require punishment of others to be validated. They exist in the act of standing firm, in the willingness to confront falsehoods, and in the acknowledgement of reality, no matter how difficult it may be.
Margaret and Howard's response, or lack thereof, further cemented the resolution. Over time, they retreated into a more private sphere, their attempts at influence and manipulation reduced to whispers that carried no weight against the openly documented truth. Friends and family no longer felt compelled to entertain their distortions. Their credibility had been quietly and decisively undermined. In a sense, the resolution was less about their behavior and more about the empowerment of those who had chosen courage and clarity. The balance had shifted, and the consequences of truth-telling, though initially taxing, had established a stable, fair, and lasting equilibrium. By the end of the month, the sense of vindication was palpable. Magnolia Hall, once simply a venue, had become a symbol of empowerment, clarity, and authentic celebration. The friends and family who had borne witness continued to reinforce that narrative, and even those who had doubted initially were now compelled to acknowledge the reality that had been publicly and visibly demonstrated. I could finally breathe fully, unencumbered by the fear of judgment or the anxiety of potential confrontation. The resolution was complete not because our parents had changed, but because we had acted with integrity, defended our choices, and allowed the truth to shine unimpeded. In that victory, there was profound freedom, a clarity that would guide us in all future endeavors. The weeks following the final confrontation and resolution were unlike anything I had ever experienced, a mixture of peace, empowerment, and forward momentum that seemed to radiate from every corner of Magnolia Hall. With the wedding behind us and the truth firmly established, Ethan and I found ourselves able to plan the next chapters of our life together without the lingering shadow of disapproval or manipulation. The venue, once merely a space for celebration, had become a symbol of transformation, an enduring reminder of courage, clarity, and the ability to claim one's narrative. As I walked through the polished halls, running my fingers along the carved wooden banisters and pausing to admire the floral arrangements still lingering from the reception,
I felt an unmistakable sense of ownership, not just over the physical space, but over my choices, my story, and my life. This was a life reclaimed, fully and unapologetically, in the light of truth. One of the most remarkable aspects of this transformation was the shift in how I engaged with family, friends, and even strangers. Without the fear of judgment or the compulsion to seek approval, conversations were freer, more authentic, and grounded in mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. Relatives who had once been caught in the web of my parents' influence now approached interactions with curiosity, admiration, and genuine interest. Even those who had doubted or hesitated initially were gradually drawn into acknowledgement of the reality we had created, a wedding celebrated with love, authenticity, and integrity, and a subsequent confrontation that demonstrated courage and self-respect. The emotional liberation was palpable, a soft but persistent energy that reminded me that empowerment is not granted, it is claimed through action, clarity, and resolve. Ethan and I began to channel this newfound empowerment into tangible projects beyond our personal lives. Magnolia Hall, already a beloved venue, became a hub for community events, celebrations, and mentorship. We initiated programs to guide young couples in planning weddings that reflected their authentic values, emphasizing transparency, integrity, and resilience in the face of familial or societal pressure. Every couple that walked through the hall, nervous or uncertain about navigating expectations, left with a sense of empowerment we had cultivated through our own experiences. It was deeply satisfying to witness this ripple effect, how standing firmly in truth could inspire others to embrace their own voice, make bold choices, and confront challenges with clarity. The venue was no longer just a business, it had become a symbol of possibility, courage, and transformation. In private moments, I reflected on how profoundly the journey had altered my perspective. The absence of my parents at the wedding, which once felt like an unbearable rejection, had revealed truths that were far more empowering than their approval ever could have been. I realized that the true measure of love and loyalty is not conditional on control or conformity, but on respect, support, and the ability to witness joy without manipulation. By asserting my boundaries, documenting the truth, and standing firm in the face of confrontation, I had not only reclaimed my agency, but had also modeled courage in a way that others could see and learn from. This insight, hard-earned and deeply personal, became a guiding principle in both my personal and professional life, shaping decisions, relationships, and future endeavors with clarity and confidence. The broader social impact of our actions also became evident over time. Friends, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances shared stories of how our example had encouraged them to address conflicts or assert boundaries in their own lives. Small acts of courage, standing up to a controlling employer, confronting long-standing family dynamics, or asserting personal choices in difficult situations were being inspired by the narrative we had lived and shared. It was a profound validation of the universal truth that courage is contagious, that speaking the truth in one context can ripple outward to affect countless others, and that empowerment, once claimed, can create waves of change far beyond the initial act. I felt honored, humbled, and deeply responsible for the example we had set.
Even in moments of quiet reflection, the symbolic power of Magnolia Hall continued to resonate. Standing on the veranda at sunset, the warm glow of the lights reflecting off polished wood and glass, I felt the culmination of months of struggle, confrontation, and resolution coalesce into a profound sense of wholeness. The venue, the wedding, the confrontation, and the subsequent validation were no longer isolated events. They were threads in a tapestry of personal growth, resilience, and empowerment. I understood, fully, that the life we had created was not defined by the absence of my parents or the conflict that had ensued,
but by the deliberate choices to act with integrity, assert truth, and embrace courage even when it was uncomfortable. As I looked at Ethan, standing quietly beside me, I felt an immense gratitude, not just for his unwavering support, but for the partnership that had allowed both of us to emerge stronger, clearer, and more aligned with our values. Together, we had transformed a personal struggle into a shared triumph, a narrative of empowerment that would continue to inform every decision, every project, and every relationship we nurtured. The journey had tested us, challenged us, and exposed vulnerabilities we had long ignored, but it had also illuminated the extraordinary potential that comes from embracing truth, courage, and authenticity without compromise. In the months that followed, our lives settled into a rhythm marked by purpose, clarity, and empowerment. Magnolia Hall thrived not only as a venue, but as a beacon of inspiration, proof that integrity and courage can prevail against manipulation and disapproval. I had found peace, fulfillment, and a renewed sense of identity, fully liberated from the shadows of judgment that had once constrained me. The final image, the enduring transformation, was clear. A life claimed with intention, a voice fully heard, and a legacy of courage and authenticity that would inspire others long after the lights of the wedding had faded. I had discovered that the power of truth, once embraced and acted upon, could not only transform a single day, but an entire life. And through that transformation, I had found purpose, empowerment, and the freedom to live authentically, unapologetically, and fully. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.